professionalizing a woman's aspirations, where if you are not holding a career like a man, you're somehow less of a person, I think fails to understand that a woman is different than a man.
Hello, and welcome to the third year of the Renaissance of Men podcast. To kick off the year, my guest this week is the president of New St. Andrews College in Moscow, Idaho, Dr. Ben Merkle. If we're going to fight the culture war at the highest level, we need higher education. And under Dr. Merkle's leadership, New St. Andrews has been doing just that, and not a moment too soon. In this conversation, we discussed the origins of New St. Andrews, Ben's story and journey to leadership, why women should go to college, postmillennialism and institutions, and Ben's vision for the future of NSA. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and please join me in welcoming this week's guest on the Renaissance of Men podcast, the president of New St. Andrews College in Moscow, Idaho, Dr. Ben Merkle. Dr. Ben Merkle, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
So I've been, like many in my community, watching the Moscow project with great interest, and of course the recent NBC News piece was also fun to watch. But it's so fascinating and inspiring to me to watch what's happening up there as you begin to reimagine American Christian society. And higher education is such an important part of the American tradition. So I have great admiration for what you're doing at New St. Andrews. So I'm excited for the chance to talk to you about this today.
Thanks very much.
So maybe let's start with how New St. Andrews was founded and what some of its founding principles were, and then we'll see if we can go a bit up to today and some of the statements that it's making about higher education in general in like the 2020s.
Sure. Yeah. So I think NSA is really there's kind of a long series of things that precede the founding of NSA. I think. Obviously, Doug Wilson is kind of a pretty significant figure in what's been going on in Moscow, and Doug has had a very prominent position both as a pastor, blogger, and speaker at conferences and author and whatnot. So you have a lot of people following him, but I think there are a number of prominent pastor authors that are out there. But one of the things that sets Doug aside really was, I think, the foresight to invest a significant amount of his work in the founding of educational institutions. And that really started in 1980 with the founding of Logos School. So that became essentially the flagship for the classical Christian school movement. So that was started in 1980 when my wife, Rebecca, was a kindergartner. He started it for her. And it was this kind of innovative experiment of applying this essay written by Dorothy Sayers, The Lost Tools of Learning, as this experimental school, which ended up doing extremely well. So in 1990, he publishes Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, which was his book on that experiment. Mm-hmm. That gets picked up. A number of people start following it, and it starts the annual ACCS conference, which begins here in Moscow, but then starts to move regionally. And it becomes this really a national movement of starting classical Christian schools. It then jumps over into the homeschooling world with things like classical conversations and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So you have this huge classical school movement. But locally, what it does is it brings together a number of families, not just on Sunday morning, but around this idea of we're building a generational project here. And as the church sort of matures theologically, becomes Reformed, becomes Calvinistic, and a number of things, that the church starts to have this expanded understanding of what cultural innovation and reformation really looks like. The school really becomes a really important piece in making that a generational deal, which I think is extremely significant. 1994, that would be when my wife graduated from Logos, the first class to have gone all the way through. That fall is when New St. Andrews is started. And it's really built on top of that, the legacy of that K-12 school. So New St. Andrews is started, and now you have people coming from all over the country, and in some instances from all over the world, in order to attend this school. And we see the community that builds around that is really, really significant. So now it's a handful of different churches all in the Moscow area, and this school, Logos, has just exploded in size. But you're starting to see it replicated elsewhere across the U.S.
And then how does your story intersect with New St. Andrews?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Boise, down in southern Idaho. I was a reservist in the Marine Corps, and came up to the University of Idaho in 1991. I heard about this weird church that I s- I actually met Doug. I'd started the University of Idaho lacrosse club. We started this lacrosse team, and Doug had started the Logos lacrosse team, and so I met him through lacrosse,
Oh, wow.
and then discovered. Yeah, it was, and I discovered that I was teaching a Bible study through Campus Crusade using this book by a guy named Doug Wilson, and suddenly
Ah,
realized it was the same guy. Um, I
wow.
I joined the NSA their very first year. I joined their Greek class because I really wanted to learn biblical Greek, and that's where I met Becca
Mhm.
in that first class, um, and was just really intrigued by the whole thing. I was falling down the stairs of Reformed theology during this time, and by the
That's a
time I
great way of putting
graduated,
it.
yeah. Yeah, whacking my head all the way down,
Yeah.
and by the time I graduated, I was, reformed, so my first job I took was, doing campus ministry, for Christ Church to the University of Idaho. Becca and I got married that first year, and within another 2 years, I was doing Greyfires, the church's ministerial training program, and I began starting to help Doug as a TA for one of his classes, which grew into a teaching position, which grew into a career.
Mhm. And then when, you're currently the president of New St. Andrews,
Yeah,
when did you take over that role?
that was about 7.5 years ago.
Okay.
I had become an instructor, but I really was kind of splitting my time between being a pastor and a teacher at NSA, going back and forth.
Mhm.
Decided I really wanted to go all in on NSA, and so that's when applied to Oxford for because I'd done a master's, but I knew I wanted the doctorate, so applied to
Mhm.
Oxford. I did a second master's at Oxford on Jewish studies, and then did my doctorate there. Came back and was executive minister at Christ Church, but then became academic dean at NSA. And then when my predecessor, Dr. Atwood, stepped down as president, then I stepped in as his replacement. So that was about 7.5, 8 years ago.
That's really fortuitous timing because it gave you about a 5-year runway before. I mean, American culture was already really shifting prior to 2020, but you were already really, rooted in the role so that when everything kind of went nuts, the COVID apocalypse, like so that I saw that YouTube video. So
Yeah.
good. So you're kind of there on the ground, really rooted to be able to be like, okay, we need to be able to respond to that, to this kind of crisis, quote
I
unquote.
I you know, I joke about how it up until just a few years ago, it had felt like God was drunk driving with my life. Just
I know that
well,
feeling.
just because, it would be like, am I a teacher? Am I a pastor? I moved on, like I
Yeah.
didn't really know what I was doing until I landed this job. And then things started coming together and you started seeing God's perfect timing and everything that he had put into place. And definitely those first few years, I had no idea what a college president was, and it was a few years of me starting to understand what was unique about NSA, why we do what we do, and what was really interesting is one of the things that the NSA board does is every quarter they read a book together, and one of the books that we read probably in 2019 was Nassim Taleb's Anti-Fragile,
Mhm.
and I remember reading this and saying, I think he's describing NSA. And it really helped us to articulate the things about NSA that we thought were unique, important, and anti-fragile. And so we'd gotten to this point where it's like, okay, we understand what we're doing, why we're doing. And then COVID hit, and
Mhm.
man, the anti-fragility of NSA and what we're doing here just became so clear and so yeah, God's timing was perfect in putting all of that together, and it's really been a huge blessing.
How many students are at NSA? It's not a large university.
No, we're a teeny little school, so we're at 227 in the undergrad, another 50 to 60 in the grad school. When I started, we were probably around 125 to 130 in the undergrad, so we've just about doubled over the last few years, and it really is this the COVID moment helped us to understand what we're doing and just launched things.
Let's talk about that. Like what were the principles, and how did the COVID moment really solidify some things and shift some other things?
Yeah. So there was just a whole number of things. Some of them seemingly small and trivial, but became really important. Things like,
Mm-hmm.
we don't have dorms, we don't have
Mm-hmm.
a cafeteria or a meal plan, and that's by design. We want our students actually involved in the real community and the life of the local churches, not in a little fake world on
Yeah.
campus. Um, and that's one of the places where schools got hit the hardest, is they didn't refund tuition, but they had to refund all their dorm, residence plans, meal plans, things like that. So we got spared all of that, which was extremely helpful. We were just in a nimble position to navigate the whole COVID moment, which was really great. But that's more trivial. The bigger things had to do with things like, in at the very center, a very robust and powerful Christian witness. The last 20 year or the last well yeah last 20 30 years,
Yeah.
Christian colleges have been um, uh, dulling their Christian witness and making deep compromises with secularism, but they've done it very quietly on campus.
Yeah.
So the students and faculty know what's going on, but donors and board members and constituents don't. And so
Oh.
they believe that this is still that classic, you know, evangelical college that Billy Graham would have wanted it to be. They think that it's that, but then you show up and it's a different world entirely. I remember going to a meeting with a um, bunch of college presidents and a very prominent Christian college president describing to us the spectrum that all the college presidents face, which is, on the one hand, you have your sort of Republican, capitalist, conservative, evangelical, and on this end, you have very Democrat, liberal, progressive ideology, leans towards socialism and whatnot. And he was like, and we all know this is where our donors and our board members are here, and our faculty and students are over here. And it's just this kind of progression. And it was like the president's job to stand in the middle and make sure that the two never encountered the other end of the spectrum. And it
Wow.
was like, that was really it's really sad. But then
Yeah.
basically over the last couple of years, that the blanket that was covering that is just getting pulled back, and
Yeah.
people are suddenly realizing what's going on college campuses and how far gone they are. And so that moment is a moment that when we've been able to really lean into, and you mentioned some of the marketing and whatnot, we've been able to be really vocal about, no, this is what we believe. And if you have a problem with saying that, guys and girls should use different bathrooms, then this isn't the school for you, because we're pretty robust about this. And that, I think, a lot of people just step back. We're like, finally a school that will say that. Somebody where PhD doesn't mean that you've been had all of your evangelical convictions removed, surgically removed. So that's been a big one. The financial model of the school has also been really big. The fact that we say no federal money, no Pell Grants, no federally subsidized student loans. Throughout the whole COVID thing, we took no PPP money. I had a phone call from the state offering us, was like 250 grand for the CARES Act, I think it was. And it was just, here's the check, where do we send it? And to be able to say, we don't want it, keep
Mhm.
it, don't send it. So we stayed out of the money completely, and that meant no strings on us, which has been
Mhm.
really important for us to hold our principles. And now seeing, student loan forgiveness, um, this is a total theft being perpetrated on America,
Yeah.
and I think, at least half of America believes this is a real wrong being done, and pretty obvious, blatant, just grab for votes. You're just
Yeah.
manipulating policy to grab some votes really quick. Um, and how many colleges can stand up and oppose it? We did a press release saying we condemn this as theft. It's wrong. And I don't think there are any other colleges that are really ready to step up and say that right now. And so that's why I say there's a number of these principles that have always been there for us. And then this moment just seems orchestrated for us to lean in, speak into the microphone, and say something about this.
Yeah, that's how I discovered what you guys were doing. Of course, I had, I've talked to Doug and Pastor Toby, and
Mhm.
and I watched what's going on up there with great interest. So I knew about New St. Andrews, but I didn't really have a good sense of context what it was until I saw your Meet Big Ed ad
Oh,
that popped
yeah,
up.
yeah.
That popped up in my YouTube feed, and I was like, okay, we got to talk about this. Because you do
Yeah,
seem, and you are very well positioned to make such very strong cultural commentary, and that
yeah.
you apply it to the higher education model, which is like a sacred cow almost in a
Oh,
way.
yeah.
And so that you guys are rooted enough and say free enough to be able to do that. It's incredibly powerful because that institution needs to be spoken against.
Yeah, it really is, it's extremely powerful. I mean, the education machine is what has enculturated the entire generation
Yeah.
into the madness that we're inside of right now,
Yeah.
and the difficulty is that even our most conservative institutions of higher ed are com complicit to some degree and to such a point that they can't really speak against it. And so they
Mhm.
can't offer a really robust alternative. And so we are, like I said, we're definitely blessed to be in this spot. I I do try to make sure to note this again and again when I'm in this kind of conversation. There were a number of principles that when I kind of walked into this office and inherited this role, these were the DNA of NSA that I inherited, and it was the real, I think, extreme foresight of the founders of the school. Doug Wilson was a big piece of that. Roy Atwood, my predecessor, early other members of the board that really established this is the DNA of NSA. They were seeing something coming that was extremely profound and built it into the school. I inherited it, so I get to pretend like this is my idea, but it was given to me.
We get to cultivate it, right? Like it's one
Oh
thing
yeah,
to, you build the ship for the storm, and you're still steering the boat. Like you didn't necessarily build it, but you're still steering the boat, which is a
yeah,
thing.
yeah. That's true. It's really true.
And, and I think this is the power. This is the power, I think, of the postmillennial philosophy. Maybe just to speculate is to say you can see something coming, and you can say that the response is to go into the basement and hide, or you can see something coming and say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to build institutions of our own to push back on this thing that's coming. It seems to be a very fundamentally different approach.
I think that that's a really, important and profound point is the application of your eschatology to how we think about education, because
Yeah.
one of the things I notice is when I look at, evangelical conservatives and they're thinking about higher ed, almost universally, all of their strategies are defensive.
Mm,
So it's about, how do I get where I want to go with as little of that college education impacting me as possible.
right.
So
Yeah.
you get like the Dave Ramsey debt plan. How can I get through without carrying a whole lot of student loan debt, which is a great thing to do. I'm
Yeah, for
not
sure.
knocking that. But you get that kind of Dave Ramsey applied to almost everything. Like, how can I get through this education with as little of it impacting me as possible? And I get out the other side with a piece of paper that I need, which is a really it's a defensive strategy rather than an offensive one. And I want to say, listen, what if we were to build institutions where you're thinking, I want as much of that college impacting me as possible because it's actually doing something good.
Mm,
Um, we don't think in terms of building the institutions that will actually be a blessing. We think of navigating the world's institutions with as little of it impacting me as possible. But I
mhm.
want to go on the offense.
Think that's great because I think college used to be that way, and my friends and I were talking about this. I think things really started to shift. It was before my time. Obviously, I wasn't in college at the time, but the movie Animal House that I think really
Yeah,
shifted the expectations of what college was. But I don't
yeah,
think it used to be that college was a blessing, and now it's an
yeah,
indoctrination factory,
yeah.
right?
It is, and I think the Animal House is a really good picture of that because I think a lot of times people think that like what's going on secular college campus is the atheist worldview coming from the philosophy professor that slowly infests and turns our kids, and that happens to some degree. But I think far more common what it is the freshman who goes off to college starts getting drunk, starts fornicating, his conscience bothers him, and that's when the philosophy prof comes in and offers him a worldview that takes away that guilt and explains it all and justifies it. And then they realize I could live this different kind of life, this hedonistic life that I have a philosophy to go with it. And that's where they end up losing the faith. But it really starts,
Mm,
I think that's one of the reasons why we said no dorms, because it starts with that dorm fraternity kind of setting you up for all kinds of sexual vices, drunkenness. Although now I think you're more likely to smoke pot than smoke cigarettes on a college campus.
Mhm.
So you've got all kinds of new things coming on as well.
Yeah, I mean, I went to Stanford in the mid '90s. My freshman year was 1996, so
Okay.
we're about 30, 20 years or so removed from our 25 years. Wow, removed from
Yeah.
our current era. And back then, you're making me remember all these things I had forgotten. Like, of course, I've
Yeah.
talked about the ethnic theme dorms, that there was a black dorm, and an
Oh, yeah.
African American dorm, and Latin American dorm, and Asian American dorm. And my freshman dorm had co-ed bathrooms on my floor. Like the
Okay.
men and women toilets were separate on opposite sides, but they shared. Like, starting to remember, and then it baffled me that this elite university social life still centers around fraternities. Like, that isn't, and
Yeah.
football. It doesn't make any sense to me. That's
Yeah.
not what I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
here for.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a particular world and life that you're being brought into to live
Yeah.
there for 4 years that really pulls you away from everything that your parents were raising you to be.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't raised with any particularly strong religious education. I wasn't raised Christian.
Mm,
I came to that later in life, but still, that the values, and it was like, it wasn't that the values were being actively promoted. It was just taken for granted. Like, this is what college is. It's like,
mhm.
wait a minute. Like, I've worked 18 years of my life to get into this institution, and now I get here. It's like the cultivation of the life of the mind is almost becomes secondary to these social practices, which totally take you away from why you went there in the first place.
Oh, yeah. So this is another interesting, piece of trivia that I've been trying to get people aware of. In 1960, typical academic work week, a college student on average spent 40 hours a week on school. That's going to class and doing homework and whatnot, which makes
Yeah.
sense. It's 40
Yeah.
hours a week, full time job. And they've been doing this study since 1960. The last one I saw was, I think, from 2018. In 2018, a typical student was working 17 and a half hours a week on school. And if you imagine, okay, 12 hours are, let's say 12 minimum credit loads, so that's supposed to be 12 hours in class, then that meant in 1960, you had to study 28 hours to be ready for school. 2018, you had to study 5.5 hours. That is less than 1/5 as much work as it used to take. So when you talk about, like, it used to be about this cultivation of life of the mind, there used to be this intellectual rigor
Mhm.
that college was expecting of you. Now it's pathetic. And what's interesting, same over that same time, the awarding of the A as a degree became
Mhm.
3 times more likely. So,
Yeah.
so you're 3 times more likely to get an A, and you have to work less than 1/5 as hard. College has become something totally different than what we once imagined it to be, and I
Yeah.
think that's also why, for instance, employers are increasingly frustrated with these graduates who they don't feel like they don't seem trained to actually hold down a job, and I think that they tend to think, "Well, it's like you studied the
Yeah.
wrong subject, so they didn't give you the right," but I think what they're not
Yeah.
realizing is it used to be when somebody graduated from college, it meant that they knew how to spend 40 hours a week working hard with their mind. Now, those students they still have not yet been exposed to a week of work.
Yeah.
And the idea of sitting down at a job and working hard is terrifying and new to them, and it's something that they're not ready for because they haven't experienced it yet.
I'm glad you mentioned the grade inflation, because that was a big scandal at, like, Harvard, right?
Yeah.
They discovered that. And when you throw in the wokeness, the indoctrination in the classes, and when you throw in affirmative action, and taking in, lower quality students, because one of the reasons I always heard you go to a great university is for the competition with your fellow students. Like, you're
Yeah.
going to algebra, trigonometry, whatever, it's all going to be the same no matter where you go. But to fight for a higher grade versus some of the best students in the country and the world, that's where a lot of the learning happens. But when you start doing the affirmative action and doing grade inflation, you take away that benefit. Kids don't have to work
Yep.
as hard.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, and I think that, college isn't what it once was, and I think that's why now colleges are in this real I was in a, being interviewed just before coming onto
Mhm.
this, and it was a guy who was doing an interview of college presidents, and and all of his questions around this, like, emergency that college presidents are feeling where their degrees don't seem to be worth what it used to be. And
No.
they're scratching their heads trying to figure out what could possibly be the cause of this. And it's like, you are not delivering the product that was once being delivered.
That's
You've
right.
completely changed it, and people don't want anymore.
Yeah, and what I like about what I've been seeing from your marketing campaigns on YouTube is that the promise of as good an education as what I was hoping to get back then is evident from what you're putting out. Like, because I
Oh
remember I
yeah.
can still go back in when I was applying for college and looking at all the brochures. Like, there was no YouTube back then, but I could look at all the brochures and stuff like that. And I look at what you guys are doing. Like, that would have been just as appealing to me as what I looked at all along. And you're doing a good job of surfacing what you have.
Well, thank you, thank you. Yeah, we've definitely rearranged our budget to push a lot into marketing. We're trying to speak into the microphone a little bit more about what it is
Mhm.
we're doing. We think this is the moment to do that.
So let's talk a little bit about the student experience at NSA educationally, extracurricularly. You've talked a little bit about dorms and lack thereof and food plans and stuff. So let's talk about from an academic perspective and from a social perspective and from an extracurricular perspective, what would a student experience coming to NSA?
Yeah. So one of the other things that's really unique about NSA that would go into the heading of the earlier conversation is the fact that we only give one undergraduate degree in liberal arts. So it's just one degree that all the undergraduates go through. We have a assortment at the grad level, but the undergrads all are doing one generalist degree in liberal arts. So it is your classic blend of literature, philosophy, history. We do music. Um, 2 years of theology, a strong emphasis on classical languages, and then there's a math science component that goes through it as well. Math, biology. We're looking to add physics this next year. So it's just kind of your classic liberal arts degree. It's we're a very small school, so you're in a small little cohort of classmates working through that program together. It actually, I think, keeping them together like that has allowed us to have a much higher degree completion rate than
Hmm.
most other colleges, because there's this kind of camaraderie that builds around the students as they're working through these classes together. They have a classical rhetoric class that they take their first year, and you're getting up in front and speaking to your classmates, arguing, debating them every single week. It is um, quirky, and then I don't think it's going on very many other places in the U.S., and yet it is quite very standard, what a standard liberal arts curriculum ought to
Yeah,
look like.
used to be.
Um, as I said, a strong classical language component. So everybody starts in their first year Latin class, and the Latin is taught as an actual spoken language. So I've noticed in the classical world, a lot of people they study Latin, but what that means is they've learned how to do Latin exercises. They've not actually learned how to read Latin, and our students are truly understanding the language. They can converse in it, and they can pick up a text and actually read in the language. So upper classes, you'll have a class on Virgil, but you're just reading Virgil in Latin, etc. But you can add classical Greek, you can add biblical Hebrew onto that as well. So a strong language component, and 2 years of theology. It's we're a teeny little school. We're right in downtown Moscow. My office is on Main Street. We're kind of at the very center of downtown Moscow. Moscow is a university town. The University of Idaho is here.
Hmm.
And so it's really built as a town to serve college students. So when I say the students need to grab an apartment, whatever, that's really not a big deal, because that's what this town does. It's really easy to get an apartment anywhere around here, and all within walking distance of NSA. So you can walk to class. We are spread out over two buildings, this building, and then we have another north campus a couple blocks up the street. Um, and really life is lived kind of on Main Street. We tend to say downtown is our campus, study at a
Hmm.
coffee shop or whatever, but it's kind of overflowing with NSA students. Um, we One of the things that's interesting about NSA, we don't have like a weekly chapel or something like that. We don't have a
Mm.
spiritual plan for the students as far as that goes, because we really want the students to be involved in one of the local churches. And so the students attend one of the local churches and tend to be really involved in the local church life. And Moscow is really unique in having a number of extremely vibrant evangelical reform congregations around here. I preach at one across the street here on Sunday mornings, but there's, Pastor Toby Sumter is about 2 blocks that way. Actually, they meet in our North Campus building. Or you can go to Christ Church with Doug Wilson, and they're all just kind of right around here. So students get sucked into the local churches and become a part of that life, which is really important to us, that they be a part of real, true church life. Trying to think of other areas you'd like me to go with that, but hopefully that kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of what NSA is like. Oh, I would add one other thing. We've recently divided the church into 3 halls, which will increasingly become academic programs, and so we've just kind of begun that work. The 3 halls then also have a whole extracurricular side to them and compete in. So this Saturday will be the rugby tournament of the 3 halls. We'll all be. My son is in one of the rugby teams, so they'll have their Jerusalem Sevens rugby tournament this Saturday. There'll be volleyball, ladies volleyball in the next term, men's basketball, and on and on. So they have an assortment of different competitions. They compete in rhetoric, declamations, and debate and whatnot, and things like that. And that goes on throughout the year. We do have one right now. We have a rowing team that actually competes nationally, which is really.
I saw your ad.
Yeah, it's really funny. It's great because it's such a. I rowed when I was in Oxford, and rowing was like a brutal. It's like if you ever done cleans and weightlifting. If you can imagine doing cleans for cardio, that's what rowing is like.
Yeah.
And it's a brutal sport. In this last at the national competition, one of our girls took 2nd in the nation, and one of their guys took 5th. So it's really fun to see them starting to compete at that level. I'm sure they'll continue to grow.
So I'm looking at all this from the perspective of I'm myself. I'm obviously not an aspirational college student, but looking at New St. Andrews, what would you say to like a 17, 18-year-old? Maybe they don't necessarily come because the pitch is very different to someone raised Christian. But what would you say to perhaps a 17 or 18-year-old who comes from a family with good values, not necessarily Christian, but a family with good values? Like they're considering some sort of maybe a state school or a private school or a New St. Andrews. What would you say to that student who's like looking at options and discovers NSA?
Yeah, so I always try to make clear that, like, first of all, I think college is oversold in one degree. So I want to make clear I don't think everybody has to go to college. I don't think college is the gatekeeper of gainful employment. So I want to make all those qualifiers that if you don't end up at college, that's not a failure, and maybe NSA is not right for everybody. But that said, I do think that there's a sweet spot that we are just truly the best at, and that is a young person who and I would make the qualification that I do think it would be important that somebody who was coming to NSA had a really devout desire to follow Christ, like a real true evangelical commitment to follow Christ. Maybe they're not maybe they weren't raised that way and they don't have the foundations out there. But I think that if they did not have that kind of commitment, they would find themselves out of place at NSA.
Fair.
So assuming you have somebody who says, look, I want to follow Christ. I don't know what I want to do. I'm generally interested in the world. I want to be pushed. I want to be challenged. I want to experience, a boot camp for my brain, for my soul, and be made into a man that serves God and that is ready to attack and transform culture for him. And I don't know what that would be, but I'm ready to get challenged. Somebody like that, I would say, come. We want you. We want to scare you, and then we want to comfort you, and we want to build you up and equip you, and send you out.
That sounds amazing. Sold.
Okay, great.
I also liked in one of your ads, you talked about preparing women for the most important job of all, which was to be mothers and to raise the next generation, because that is a question that's out there. Like, should girls go to college? And obviously, I don't think there's any detriment to going to a school like NSA, but obviously, as you discussed so well in the Meet Beg Ed ad, that like there's things that'll cost you if you go to public school. So maybe talk a little bit about that dimension as well.
So I think there's kind of a ditch on either side of the road when you're speaking about like how a woman ought to be preparing herself, particularly as she steps out of high school graduation, and how she should be um, what she should be pursuing. On the one hand, I think you have a real problem with um, basically treating women as if they're indistinguishable from men and that they should be held up to the exact same standards as men. Because what tends to happen is, this is at the root of abortion, is we have pathologized the female body and said that if you can't perform everything exactly like a man does, then you're somehow deficient and wrong, and falling short. And so if a pregnancy gets in the way of you pursuing a career the way a man does, then we need to be able, you have like a constitutional right to have that thing removed
Mm,
so that you can be performed the way a man does. I think that's really a problem.
yeah.
And professionalizing a woman's aspirations, where if you are not holding a career like a man, you're somehow less of a person, I think fails to understand that a woman is different than a man.
Mm,
And so I want to be really, we want to be careful about that. On the flip side, um, I think that the where we've gone wrong is a lot of people have said, okay, so if a woman shouldn't be pursuing a professional career, then she shouldn't be pursuing an education.
mm,
And by doing that, we make education and career synonymous. And I don't think that that's the way they're supposed
mm,
to be. I think an education is the formation of the person. And I think to be a woman, to be a woman of great excellence, can require a great and profound education. And I would say I've learned so much of this actually out of just being married to my own wife,
mm,
who was that guinea pig for the whole classical ed movement. I found a great bit of gratitude and thanksgiving for the fact that I'm married to a woman of great intelligence and who has an ability to think clearly and who has been educated to a very high level. It's for her, it is not a career focus; it's a person focus. It's to be who she is, and particularly to be a wife to me and to be a mother to my children. She wrote a book a couple years ago called Eve in Exile, which is
I
now
saw
a
the documentary.
documentary. Yeah, and those works really articulate, I think, her reflections on this subject. So I we believe strongly that the women in our college should get the same education as the men, should be pushed as hard, should be as intellectually challenged, and should be as educated. But we don't see that as needing the validation of a vocational track or a career in order to make it worthwhile.
Mhm.
So those are the two things that we're trying to kind of hold together, and it makes for a really interesting town, I think.
I think that's beautiful. I think so many of these discussions um, tend to one version or another of really low resolution. But when you frame it as, higher education is for educating the person, not necessarily pre-professional or career, it
Yeah,
removes all of that and says, no, like a woman can and should experience the richness of becoming a full person and not be denied that, or not necessarily be, go through a cookie cutter factory education preparing for dehumanizing career. Like that
yeah,
kind of way of framing it is like everyone should experience that, and you can see it as a universal good, not necessarily related to either sex, but that we is our almost birthright as human beings, maybe.
yeah. I think that that's exactly right.
So I guess you mentioned the Eve in Exile documentary, and I remember a scene from that documentary where she's talking about making the kitchen. You know,
Oh, yeah,
but yeah, and
yeah,
my question related to that is everyone up there, and well, you've kind of become public people in a way, and it must be a bit of it must be a bit of an, I don't know if it's an unexpected shift, totally unexpected shift, but what has that been like to kind of go from being a small, town trying to do this thing to suddenly having this national spotlight, to whatever degree you feel
yeah.
comfortable talking about that?
It's true that that has happened. It doesn't, most of the time, I don't notice it because it's such a small town. Because it's such a small town, it's not weird to walk down the street and say hi to everybody because that's just what you would do in a small town anyways. What's weird is then when you leave town, to travel and
Yeah.
people then start to know you, like, that's kind of unsettling, and I don't I don't notice it until most of the time when I'm traveling on the road. But most of the time, we're just doing what we would normally do. It's just that more often than not, now there's a camera that's somewhere in the room filming something. But I
Mm,
tend to not think about it. We're just trying to be faithful with what's in front of us. And then it is kind of funny how when I travel, how frequently now, just like in airports, people will recognize me from doing Ask Doug segments or something like that, you know. But that's still it's not going to my head because it's still pretty small fries, you know.
mhm. Do you get I'd imagine you probably get more support than the media would make it seem, maybe.
Oh yeah. I mean, one thing, this is a charming quirk of Doug's, is his complete unflappability about um, firestorms,
Yeah.
and becoming more and more a part of that family, and raising my family in the midst of it has meant that we've gotten pretty immune to people freaking out. You know, it the people spitting on the window, that's just what
Mhm,
happens. Or
mhm.
like yesterday, somebody filed a complaint with the city about um, my home, whether I was violating zoning by having too many people live in my house, which was and those sorts of things just happen all the
Mhm.
time. They'll file charges or break your windows or whatever,
Oh,
and it's gotten
sorry.
into something that's just kind of quirk lovable about the town. I'm honestly, it doesn't really hurt. We more just kind of snicker about it because it's just the what it's like. And when you're around Doug, you kind of start to get accustomed to, like, oh, NBC's here today. Okay, BBC next week. No big deal.
Mhm,
We tend to blow it off, and then we mostly live in just a small, pleasant little town, and
mhm,
this stuff kind of circles around, but you don't notice it that much.
mhm. And of course, the recent NBC News segment highlighted some of the conflict in the town, specifically related to the university. That you have University of Idaho students and
Mhm.
NSA students in close proximity. Like,
Yeah.
what's that friction point like? I guess from an administrative perspective, and maybe from a student perspective as well. And how do the students handle it?
Um, you know, it's funny because the University of Idaho students are not very interested in debate or having their worldview expanded or anything like that. I would say there's hardly any.
No way.
Yeah, I know, it's strange. I mean, it used to be like if you would do a debate, like we did earlier this week, we did a big event, and we did on the University of Idaho campus, called Life After Roe. We brought in a bunch of speakers and whatnot to two pro-life and two pro-choice to walk through the implications of the Dobbs ruling,
Hmm.
and brought in some national scholars. It was really an interesting event. Show up on the U of I campus, it is a 99% church audience, almost no. Um, they're just not interested in conversation anymore.
Mm,
They don't do that. If they show up to scream and protest, but you don't get dialogue anymore the way you used to 20 years ago. It just
mhm,
doesn't really happen. And so as a town, and particularly I think the COVID moment, and it's just a great, is extremely unfortunate. The COVID moment really created segregation in our town, unlike anything before,
mhm,
um, because of how over the top they were on mask things and whatnot. The town kind of sorted itself, and
mm,
I don't think it's really resorted since then, which is, I think, a really unfortunate kind of thing. And it's just very difficult to get conversation now.
mhm. There's some advantage in that. It's like, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say, yeah, there was a move. I don't think it's gonna pass the city council, but our local human rights commission is proposing this sticker that, if you make a certain pledge to diversity, which would have to include a statement about GLBT, whatever stuff, then there'll be like this city sponsored sticker that can go on your business, and
Ooh.
that way people will know, what kind of business you are and whether you can go in there or not. and there already is a list that's always sent around pretty
Yeah.
regularly on social media about which businesses are owned or affiliated with somebody from Christchurch, and they segregate like that. And so it's really unfortunate, but I just don't think that there's the integration that they used to have.
Are they going to pass something that like you have to sew a patch onto your code or something like that? Is that next?
I know. We wanted to like just volunteer a star or something like that you could put on.
What could
It
possibly go
is,
wrong?
yeah, it's kind of creepy sometimes, but at the same time,
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah. So I wanted to also ask about the faculty because I have seen there's some really great lectures that you have available on the NSA YouTube channel. Really fascinating things. I think I watched something quickly today about the Augustinian moment in terms of education, and then I can't remember the name, something with a C. That just to talk a little bit about the nature of the education and what some of the faculty gets into.
Yeah, it is a really interesting faculty. I mean, I think that what's really interesting is getting a faculty member who's both a specialist in his career and yet appreciative of the contribution of the other disciplines,
Hmm.
which is something like a lot of schools, you can have somebody who's really particularly good in their discipline, but they have zero conception of what's going on outside of their department or outside of their one little spot. Whereas here, by definition, you have to have a really intense integration of all the subjects. And so cultivating a faculty that's specialist and yet prioritizes integration, I think creates a whole new set of conversation that I think is a lot of fun. It's I think a really interesting and robust faculty. I think definitely because of all the growth we're going through, we're actually going through quite a lot of hiring right now, and we're doing a lot of collecting new guys and bringing in some new faces, which is making it a pretty interesting kind of moment.
I'm curious about the growth. More students, more faculty. I mean, I imagine that the vision is only to get to a certain size, or maybe not. But to
Yeah,
preserve the
yeah.
values, you have to keep it almost a certain size.
Yeah, so what we're hoping to do, or we're in the middle of doing, is we'd like to grow. I don't think we would go over 1,000. We would keep it under that. But what we'd like to do is take. I mentioned these three halls that we're divided into. Those three halls will eventually become three distinct colleges, and so I'd like to have three colleges, each one less than 200 students. So I want to preserve that small, quirky little college of under 200 students, but have another college exactly like you across the street that's kind of like your arch rival.
Gryffindor
I'm
and
basically
Slytherin.
stealing from the Oxford model. And then
Yeah.
you have an administration that's floated on top. So you get the economy of scale by having the administration that all three share.
Mhm.
So that's where we're headed.
And then I did watch one of your talks. Maybe it was your annual address, where you shared a bunch of things that major American universities do that you don't do. I wonder if you could share what some of those are, because I thought that was really important.
Okay, I'm trying to remember what that one was.
Well, you mentioned, you don't take government money was one of them, and some what the insight looks like from inside the high level university picture.
So yeah, so no federal money, no student loans, no Pell Grants. Like I said, we don't do any of the PPP money. So staying out of that whole thing, it keeps us free of the strings that attach, but it also keeps us more responsive, I think, to the free market of where our tuition setting needs to be. So staying out of that, not doing majors, I think has been a really
Mm.
important thing to us. We don't do a bunch of vocationally specific majors. That tends to throw people because they want to think that their degree will promise them a certain job. But I don't think that that's what college degrees do, anyways. And I think we're much better at focusing on these core skills of the person. So, not doing majors. We don't do dorms or meal plans. And again, I think that that's really important because we keep the students in real life.
Mhm.
The idea of graduating from college and needing to find a job, needing to find a house, needing to find a church. Those are not weird for our students because they've been doing it the whole 4 years that they were here. Um, one of the one of the pieces of data that I think is most striking about NSA is we survey our alums at 15 years after graduation, and 15 years after graduation, we have a less than 3% divorce rate. Um, So, and I think that
Wow.
that has to do with the kind of life that they have while they're here as students. There's a certain foundation that we're building. So, not having dorms, not having chapel, we expect them to be involved in a local church. I think all of those things really play into the kind of product that we're trying to produce.
I think that's one of the favorite. You've said a lot of really wonderful things, but the favorite thing I've heard you say is that 3% statistic, because who would have thought that higher education can be tied to happy families and happy marriage? Like, we're taught
Well,
that those two things are. Go ahead.
yeah, well, the thing that I hear a lot when I talk to Christian families is they'll say, "Listen, I I gave my kid, I sacrificed to pay for tuition through K to 12 or to my wife stayed home and we homeschooled and we were faithful K to 12. So they have a Christian education, they have a Christian worldview, the foundation is established. Now they can go off to college and get their degree in engineering, whatever, because college will be about vocational certification. They need to get a job, so they need to get that piece of paper to do it. And I've done the worldview foundation here. And the thing that I always want to ask is, okay, just take me back to your own life and take me to the years 18 through 22. Were
Mhm.
those the inconsequential years? Were those the years where it's like, oh, all the character formation had been established? 18 to 22 was just very boring. No ideological change, no whatever. I mean, it's laughable because we all know 18 to 22 was many people became a Christian during those years. Many more, maybe they were a Christian, but they came to a much more profound personal ownership of their faith, maybe went through theological transformation. I mean, for me, that's when my theological transformation happened. Your understanding of vocationally what you wanted to throw yourself after, and in particular, um, your family, like who you married and the foundation that that marriage was built on. 18 to 22 was when all of that work was laid. And so when you take that 18 to 22 and you put it inside a faithful community of mature disciplers and mentors, challenging you, pushing you, modeling for you what marriage and parenting looks like, but encouraging you and giving you input, and that utterly transforms the what is accomplished during that 18 to 22. It makes you into a different kind of person. And it's and I'm not minimizing what happened in K to 12. I'm not minimizing that at
Sure.
all. That was really important to lay. That was an important foundation to lay, but there's something still that needs to be done. And to do that in the context of a faithful covenant community is profound, and it's profound for the rest of your life. I think that those are the most strategic years really in the formation of that person.
Was this something that you discovered after the fact, or was this kind of built in from the beginning? Because that is incredibly profound.
Yeah, it was definitely discovered after the fact. It wasn't until I became president we started doing this survey and figuring out because we had this desire to say we want to graduate students who go out and shape culture and transform it in faithful ways. So we build this education, we do all this stuff, and then we send them out. And then when I stepped in this position, I was like, well, let's go look at our alumni and see, is this actually happening? Are we actually having the impact that we want? And it was really refreshing to see that all of these principled decisions were actually having the impact that we wanted. Alongside that 3% divorce rate was basically the exact same in apostasy rate. The 97% are worshiping still at an evangelical church, and faithful, um, almost without exception. All of them are giving their children. All of them that have kids are giving their children a Christian education. Almost none putting their kids in the public school system. A disproportionate number of the men who are church officers. And so starting to see the kind of fruit of the degree is really fun. I think we have a long ways to go. We have a long ways to go. NSA is nowhere near where I would like to have it, but the first round has gone extremely well, and I'm excited to see where it goes.
What are some of the things you'd like to add in into the second round?
I think the part of it is just getting more mature at what we're doing. I'd love to
Hmm.
see our rigor get better, get more focus on the product that we're delivering. One of the things that I would really like to see over the next 10 years is to my idea is that I think colleges in general are not very good at actually certifying people for careers. I think most vocational training is best as on the job training. I
Mhm.
think that college is best when it's focusing on the core skills of the person. So what I would like to do is continue this robust liberal arts education, but have a ring around just immediately outside of NSA of strategic, culture engaging industries that are pulling students into internships and apprenticeships and pulling them into work so that they get the vocational training they get, but they get it from the person who can best give it to them. So then you get the best of both worlds, a college that is doing what it does best, but a job giving you what it does best. And we're starting to see that. Canon Press is just down the road. They grab a ton of our students and teach them film, writing, editing, marketing, and all of that. So a lot of the Canon team are just NSA students that they pulled in. We had an economic modeling firm that did this really intensely. They're probably doing less with them now, but there are other companies that are kind of developing right around NSA and grabbing students and pulling them into internships. So I'd like to see that developed to be a little more formal and a little more competitive. And I think that it will have a disproportionate impact if we do that right.
That's fantastic. So, sort of addressing the inner life, the educational life, and then the professional life all in one.
Yeah, exactly. And particularly, I think these students are being given a profound education. So let's deploy it and find the industries where we can, I want to do the most damage to the culture as I possibly can. So what are the things that we can put just outside that would deploy this most effectively?
So, sort of training up culture warriors in professional and high achieving fields.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that we need internships in finance. We're already building it in law and policy. We need more in marketing and in media. We have a ministerial training program. I'd like to be fueling that more. So getting those things more clear.
How incredibly inspiring.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I just have one more question. I know you're a busy man. You got to get off to the airport. But as you look at the past 7 or so years that you spent at NSA, and you're looking at all the things that have changed and the moment that you inherited, what what makes you smile the most? What makes you proudest of what you guys are accomplishing there? Maybe what you're accomplishing personally, what the team is accomplishing. The thing that you
Yeah.
look at and you're like, yes,
Oh yeah, that's easily. It's
good.
it's seeing going out and seeing grads, seeing alums who are um, faithful in churches, families, starting schools, and living out what we have here. I mean, I love it when we bump into alumni and particularly seeing their kids. When you see happy little kids who are excited to be a part of the family they're in, it's just a profound testimony.
Wow, that's beautiful. The Alumni Association is the best part.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you very much. Where can people go to find out more about you or NSA? Where would you like to send them to?
Yeah, definitely nsa.edu. Hit that webpage, and there's a wealth of material about what we're doing there.
Thank you so much, Ben. This has been a real blessing to learn about all this.
Thank you.